Good afternoon. My name is Rusty Arias, and I am pleased to welcome you to the first event in PPIC's Speakers Series on California's future. When I joined the PPIC Board of Directors, it was explained to me that this is a forum where polecats and wolverines can have a reasonable discussion on issues not always discussed peacefully in the wild. Of course, I want to be clear that I am not calling either of our special guests today any names or suggesting how they behave outside these walls. Senator Brian Jones, highly respected and well-liked Senate Minority Leader, is with us. The Democratic Pro Tem thinks so much of Mr. Jones that he reaches across the aisle to work with him regularly, including on major legislative packages such as significant reform on California fire mitigation and suppression response. We may find out this afternoon if Senator Jones has plans to seek government housing at an old home not far from here, built in 1877, that has been used by 14 Californians as a place where they are given 4 years at a time to live for free.
In the basement?
I don't want to shortchange the presence of Assembly Minority Leader James Gallagher. If there is anyone who understands what it means to swim against the tide, Mr. Gallagher is a clear example, a farmer's son who chose to continue his education in the liberal halls of UC Berkeley. He's a Republican champion at a time when progressive politics rolls through the Capitol like a boulder. I would also like to mention the honor of being here with members of the PPIC Board of Directors who have left their own unique stamp on California, Cassandra Pai and David Traversi, and of course, former California Supreme Court Chief Justice and PPIC President and CEO Tani Cantil Sakuye. PPIC is fortunate to have support for this series from diverse groups of foundations and also corporate sponsors, as well as the PPIC donor circle and corporate circle, who understand that our democracy is best served when different ideas are shared with common respect. All of us in this room have chosen to make the evolution of public policy a part of our professional and personal lives. We have, in fact, chosen a profession where two people can have absolutely opposing viewpoints, and yet both of us can be right. Again, the strength of our democracy is not found in the extreme edges of intransigence and vitriol, but in the discovery of a moral center. One of the truly great legislators of modern California, the late Speaker Bob Moretti, was asked, "What is it that politicians do?" His short answer: they shape destiny. The subject today is the future of California. In answering the questions about what awaits us, it is important to remember that history has accorded our guests this morning extraordinary authority and responsibility. On December 15th, 1849, when California was beginning a century and a half of growth and a population migration unprecedented without the displacement of war, 16 senators and 36 assembly members gathered for a meeting in their respective chambers for the first time. They didn't know there was a name for it, but an atmospheric rain was drenching the northern regions of the state. A series of storms began at the end of October, and by December, travel by horse and coach was difficult. The issues of the day were dominated by mining interests, and the population of the entire state could have fit with room to spare in the Rose Bowl. What was understood by those 52 original members was a legacy was being written. The few and the daring would be writing the framework by which future generations would build personal and business lives. California would remain so pristine that 50 years later, visiting President Theodore Roosevelt said California was west of the West. And 130 years later, the voice of the farmer was heard in a now lost rural caucus. California is now home to more than 40 million people. I was raised before the new math was taught in school, but it is fair to say that more than 100 million people have, since the legislature first met, have called California home. Again, I will defer to any mathematician in the room, but it is also fair to say that less than 4,300 men and women, the first woman arriving in the Assembly in 1918 and the first woman into the Senate in 1977, has served as members of the legislature. The many are led by the few. Today, it is my honor to introduce two of those leaders. Please welcome the Honorable Senator Brian Jones and the Honorable Assembly Member James Gallagher. Just a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Tani. If you're from Sacramento and in the room, raise your hand and the PPIC staff will come to you with a microphone when we get to the question and answer period. If you are here virtually, please send your questions to ppiceventquestion@gmail.com, ppiceventquestion@gmail.com. Include your name and organization along with your question. PPIC staff will be monitoring questions. And the last thing, please monitor your phone and put it on silent. I'd like to now turn it over to Tani Cantil-Sikawe, the President and CEO of PPIC, who will moderate today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Rusty.
Very good, well done.
Rusty, we truly appreciate the history that you've given us of our great state and our leaders and the important policy that they shape, including yourself when you were a renowned legislator here in California. I want to welcome all of you to our first event for the speaker series, as Rusty has said. And I also want to recognize, as part of our civics in the PPIC space, McClatchy High School seniors, government students. We have several tables. Please wave with your teacher here. And I'm going to warn our leaders here that they will have a question for you during the question and answer period. I also want to tell you that the fuller biographies of these great leaders are already on our website, so please visit that. But I wanted to give you a little flavor of who they are and how they came here today and the record of their public service. And I'm going to start alphabetically with Republican Assembly Member, Minority Leader James Gallagher. Assembly Republican Leader Gallagher represents California's 3rd Assembly District and has done so for approximately 11 years. Prior to becoming elected to the Assembly, he served on the Sutter County Board of Supervisors for 6 years. As you heard, he's a Berkeley grad and a UC Davis School of Law lawyer, also my alum. He lives in and raises his family in Sutter County. Next is Republican Senator and Minority Leader Brian W. Jones, San Diego. He represents California's 40th district, and prior to this, Senator Jones was elected to represent California's 38th district. He has vast experience, having served in the Assembly, where he was elected and served California's 77th and 71st Assembly districts. Prior to his state leadership, like Leader Gallagher, he served as a Santee City Council member. The senator is a graduate of Grossmont Community College and also San Diego State University. He lives in Santee with his wife and enjoys spending time with their 3 adult children. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here. This audience really faced intrepid weather to be here today. We appreciate that. And I'm going to start with the first question to you, Senator Jones, and that is, what in your view are 1 or 2 of the biggest issues facing California that the governor and the legislature should take action on?
I think the 2 biggest for the last several years obviously have been affordability, cost of living, and public safety, which the voters resoundingly voted on that in November. For the first time since 1980 in the Republican caucus, we beat a Democrat incumbent to pick up a seat in the Senate caucus. So we've picked up 2 seats over the last 2 years. And then, James had similar success in the Assembly as well. The voters are catching on to what's going on. And then, of course, in the last couple of weeks, fires, wildfire, and insurance and recovery have come to the top of the issues as well.
Thank you. And when you put your finger on naming those top 3, PPIC does a survey, and so for the last several years, those 3 subjects have been what's on people's minds statewide. And so, Leader Gallagher, do you have anything to add to that?
Cost of living, I think, is the number 1 issue. I often said during the campaign, last cycle, that the biggest issue on the average Californian's mind is, how do I pay the bills? The utility bills, gas, housing costs, rent, eggs, right?
Yes.
So all these things I think are really burdening, Californians, and it's, this has always been the state that everyone wants to come to, and we have so many great things in the state of California. Obviously, climate, environment, natural beauty, everything that you could really want, but it's becoming incredibly hard to live, and to make it. So I think, that's a big issue that should be priority number 1. And then obviously wildfire, once again, has reared its ugly head in the state. And that's something that we really need to get on. Something I've been talking about for many years, representing Paradise, where we had the devastating campfire. And the key issue there is, and take this home, is we have to reduce devastating fuel loads on our lands. Vegetation, shrubs, chaparral, thinning of brush and small trees in our forested lands. Those are all things that we need to really put some focus in, because that is the number 1 cause of these catastrophic fires. We've made some inroads there, but we need to do a whole lot more.
Yeah.
Thank you, and I know of your experience. I'm going to follow up with you on the next question. But I do want to say both of you have touched on exactly what our high school students have said to us today in our morning civics presentation about what's on their mind about affordability and housing. And California is a wonderful place to come to, and people talk about you live in California, but we have our challenges. So speaking of the campfire and your experience, Assemblymember Gallagher, our state's been confronting devastating wildfires for some time, and most recently, as we all know, in Los Angeles. So in your view, what are the most important things the state can do to help the affected areas rebuild if they choose to do so?
First, removing some of those barriers, regulatory barriers. Now, we've seen some of that, so far. I mean, the governor had his executive order that streamlined some of the CEQA and Coastal Commission. I think that really drew a huge highlight on the Coastal Commission and how difficult it is to work through many of their regulations. So many people, I think, were highlighting that the governor, came out with the executive order. I think there's still more that needs to be done, by the way. Like, there's only things that can really be done by legislation and changing state law. But certainly, like, trying to remove some of those barriers so that people can get back to their homes. I think another thing's really going to become apparent is that you probably don't have enough with just your public staff at the building inspection office to handle permits. You're probably going to need to utilize the public sector. Nonprofits and what they can bring to the table, I think, is going to be a huge thing, because there are so many things that that government just can't cover, that I think your nonprofits could step in and help with recovery in those areas. So those would be the things that I'd really focus on, speeding up the timelines with government and bureaucracies so that people can get back onto their properties, debris removal, and then rebuilding their properties, and then really utilizing the private sector and your nonprofit world to kind of help with providing additional assistance, additional resources.
Thank you. I have some follow-up questions, and I wonder, Senator Jones, what role do you think the federal government has in helping our state? And add to this also to, if you have a reaction to anything about the Trump administration seeking to place some conditions on wildfire aid in California.
Well, specifically, what the federal government can do is get the aid to the victims as quickly as possible, and then remove any barriers that the federal government can put in place. And the president last week, when James and I were with him in Pacific Palisades, made it very clear that he was going to do everything that he could to remove those federal permitting barriers. But the citizens that were there, that homes had just burnt down, were complaining that it was the Army Corps of Engineers that was holding up some of the cleanup. And so there is some more work to do there on the federal side. As far as tying the aid to policy changes, no, those need to be bifurcated in two different things. Like the folks in Pacific Palisades, maybe they voted for the people that passed these policies, maybe they didn't vote for the people that passed, but it doesn't matter. They're the victims of a wildfire, and we need, that's what we do as Americans. We help the people that need help. Additionally, we do need some policy reforms here in California. Additionally, I appreciate the president pointing out some of the fallacies of our regulatory schemes here in California. So anything that he can do to help move the needle on those things will be helpful, I think, to all Californians, not just the victims, but all Californians. But it needs to be done in a deliberative manner. The president doesn't have the authority to just pound his fist on the table and say, this is how I want it done. It's got to go through Congress, it's got to go through the legislature, it's got to go through a process that the people support.
Thank you. I appreciate how you have told us, and we all agree, crisis and fire and devastation is not a political issue. And so every effort to, as Assembly Leader Gallagher has said, to remove the barriers, as you have said, to try to let people get back and build will be the important part to all Californians.
I think, if I can interrupt real quick,
Sure.
An important part of that conversation, though, also has to be somebody made a mistake. Now, look, it's a natural wildfire, and we still don't know how it started. Right. But there was glaring government mistakes that were made in the ability to fight that fire. Why was there no water in a fire hydrant? Why are fire hydrants being stolen? Why were the fire trucks not able to get where they needed to be? And I don't want to, we all should expect accountability from our government. And an elected official or an appointed person somewhere made these decisions that exasperated and made the wildfire worse. And those people need to be held accountable. And I don't know what that looks like at this point in time, but they don't get to walk away from this without at least some questions.
Understood. And it sounds like wildfire prevention is a lot of what Assemblymember Gallagher was saying about clearing the fuel. And it's also about preparation with an eye toward our infrastructure and ensuring that our infrastructure is servicing our people.
Right.
I'm going to switch to a different subject, but one I think has been on the minds of a lot of Californians, particularly in one of our recent PPIC surveys, and that is economy and jobs. So over the long term, economic growth in California has outpaced the nation as a whole. But recently, our state's economy has cooled in recent years. So what can state policymakers do to bolster the California economy and encourage sustained statewide, broad-based job growth?
Who do you want to go first?
You.
Oh, okay, thank you. So the best way to do that is just shut down the Capitol for a couple of years, the Capitol building, so there's no more new regulations. Send us all home to our districts, to legislate and serve our constituents, which is obviously not realistic. But it just goes back to what I said earlier, regulatory reform. California is too regulated. California has, I think we're the #1 state for licensed occupations. And I served on the Business and Professions Committee. I mean, the number of professions that that Sacramento tells people how to do their job is way inappropriate at this point in time. And so we need a wholesale reform on what impediments is state government putting in people's way of doing their job. People want to work. People want to do their job. People want to start businesses. Yeah. But when you don't understand the tax code, when you don't understand the environmental regulations, when you don't understand, all the different inspectors that have to come into your building. I remember when I was running for the assembly in 2010, I haven't told this story in a while. I was working part-time at a motorcycle dealer just to kind of make ends meet while I was running for office. And I'm at the motorcycle dealer, and this gentleman comes in with a clipboard, kind of trudges onto the property, and I go, "Can I help you?" He goes, "I'm here to inspect your air compressor." And I go, "The fire department just did their fire inspection last week." He goes, "No, that's different. I'm here from the state. I have to inspect your air compressor." You have to have a permit in California to have an air compressor in your mechanic shop, to my point.
So perfect can be the enemy of good.
Yes.
Assemblymember Gallagher?
Well, I'd argue it's not perfect. It's not perfect in any way. What we have is, a growth of too much bureaucracy, too many laws and regulations that I think really stifle innovation, they stifle investment, and they stifle ability to grow jobs, in this state. And but let me say what's going really well. We have a renowned university system, right? We've always attracted some of the brightest minds to California. That's a huge thing, and I think that's helped us then catapult that into new innovation, new technology, and investments in this state. But we're starting to lose that, right? People are graduating from here. I think for the first time last year, we had a net migration out of California of young professionals, right, with professional degrees. They're going to other states. They're going to Texas, They're going to Florida. They're going to some of these other states where those barriers don't exist, where you can actually get affordable housing, for instance, right? That's the other thing. We're graduating people, from, say, Stanford or I'm sorry, I should never say Stanford, UC Berkeley.
San Diego State, San Diego Aztecs.
And
community college.
Yeah, I went there.
So
to find an affordable house in the Silicon Valley, it's impossible, right? And then when we go to try and build new housing in this state, we have the California Environmental Quality Act that is not only a burden in itself, but then when people file lawsuits against those housing projects, they get stopped up. So we don't have housing. And then when people try to go, hey, let's build a warehouse or let's build, a processing facility, they run into those same barriers, and so we're losing that. And I think that is the biggest impediment. We need to really step back, streamline those processes so that we can make California investable again.
Anything to add to that, Senator?
Well, actually, the Assemblymember picked up on a very important issue that's bubbled up now, is this whole warehouse construction. Where can you place a warehouse in California? It's ridiculous, the regulations that were passed last year through the legislature. I get usually more frustrated with the regulations passed by bureaucracies, but the legislature passing these where you can place a warehouse, in what areas of the state you can put them, has now so regulated that this is what's happening right now. Products are getting off the ship in Long Beach, put on a train to go to Phoenix, to go to a warehouse in Phoenix to be broken down and moved around and reconfigured, to put back on a truck to come back into LA. Because the company that wants to build the warehouse to do all the extra stuff, the logistics of it, can't do it here in California. So is driving a train to Phoenix and then trucks back saving us any greenhouse gas emissions over having the warehouse in the where it should be? No, it's not. So you're going to hear more about this because it's going to be very detrimental to our economy.
Are there proposals currently on the table that address some of these concerns, as you've described, that are quite specific and appear that there could be approaches to it, especially with new members in the legislature? I'm going to ask you, Assemblymember Gallagher.
Well, one has been the R&D tax credit. Has been a big issue, and that was reduced. And we need a lot of people have been saying, hey, we need to bring that back or expand it. To give businesses an incentive, right, to do more investment, right. Those are things. But CEQA reform has been it's been blocked every time. Now, look. I could tell you, over the last, I've been 11 years almost now in the legislature, I could go back through every legislative session, and there's a ton of Republican bills that either exempt CEQA, streamline CEQA, use the judicial council process to shorten the time frame for when you could bring lawsuits. We've come up with so many different ideas, and every single one of them gets killed in committee.
Unless you're building a stadium.
Yeah, except if you're building a stadium, that's right.
Or high-speed rail.
High-speed rail, different things. But what we do is we piecemeal things. We keep piecemealing things, and you never really get the fully streamlined, fully reformed process that would actually lead to that better investment, whether it's from a housing component or new businesses, investments in infrastructure, capital. They all get blocked up, by what I see as kind of an overgrown bureaucratic state, and a legal environment that is just not friendly to business investment. And it keeps getting brought up, and even now, the first thing I did when I came in this session is I sent out a letter to my colleagues, and I said, hey, we have these committees, let's use them. For the first few months, we just sit there, and we maybe sometimes have an informational hearing. We wait for bills that people introduce to come to us. Instead of these committees meeting every week and saying, hey, what are the biggest issues in water? Hey, what are the biggest issues in housing? What are the biggest issues on economic development? And let's start working on those things, and maybe we actually come up with bipartisan committee bills that could tackle those issues and say, hey, here's how we can actually change laws, we can make reforms that would improve that. We haven't done that, and it is very frustrating.
For our high school students, I would say that CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. It is a decades-old act that is in statute and in guidelines and in regulations. And in California, in order to build a project which is pretty broadly defined, the initial question is whether or not the project could have an adverse environmental impact. If it does, then there's a series of steps that have to go into a report that's being used as an informational document to help leaders decide how to proceed, whether to build it, whether to mitigate it, whether not to build it at all. And it is a very lengthy process at an administrative level, and typically most CEQA cases then move to the courts, and they are expedited, but they still take many, many years, and they take a project like housing or warehouses, and it suspends its development, essentially, until the litigation clears.
It's called the California Environmental Quality Act, but what it actually is a plaintiff attorney's full employment act.
No comment. I'm going to turn to it's a related regulations and restrictions in California, and it's about California's home insurance market. So I see you smile. It's been under tremendous pressure for years, even before the most recent wildfires. And the wildfires have placed an additional strain, no question, on households and insurers. What will it take to ensure the availability of home insurance and to stabilize its costs for us? And that's to you, Senator Jones.
Thank you. So, California's actually not the only state going through this right now with and I'm going to call it a crisis, insurance crisis. Florida is coming out of theirs. There's another couple of states that are kind of on the verge, Colorado and some others. But California is unique in that we have Prop 103, which was a people's proposition initiative back in the 1990s that reformed how we do insurance in California and put one person basically in charge, and that's the insurance commissioner, who's elected by all of us. And so now we've politicized that position to where that, and it matters a little bit who's in that position, but it also doesn't matter because it's a political position, and that person, whoever they are, wants to get reelected. And so some of the decisions they're making are going to be based on politics rather than on science or economics or whatever. And so now we've gone so far off the rails in California when it comes to home insurance, auto insurance, that our rates and our coverage are just completely out of whack. I mean, again, back to the regulations, the legislature telling insurance companies what they have to cover, in my opinion, is a command and control economy that is inappropriate for a free market system. And so we need to back off the regulations a little bit. We need to give the insurance commissioner a little bit more authority, although they don't always use all the authority they do have. And then bring the insurance companies to the table and and they're telling us what they want, by the way, and what they need to stay in business here. It doesn't benefit any of us. Not one single person in California is benefited if one insurance company leaves the market. And they're not leaving the market because they don't like California and they don't like Californians. They're leaving the market because our regulatory system is so bad, they can't find a way to navigate the regulatory system, charge a fair premium, and stay in business. And we all need to understand and recognize how spectacular and I guess spectacular is the best word I can come up with for a company, a for-profit company that has been in the state for 100 years, to have that corporate board conversation and say, you know what, we got to leave California. We can't make it in California. Most of us don't understand that conversation because we're not at that corporate board level. But for those of you that serve on a board or even at a nonprofit, just think about that conversation, saying we're going to stop doing that, whatever it is that's a key part of your business, and then move someplace else. It's unfathomable that those conversations are taking place in these insurance companies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Assemblymember Gallagher, I'd like to hear your point of view, especially because, as you mentioned earlier, with the experience with the campfire.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what my colleague just said. I mean, just think for a second. Right now they're saying to write a policy right now, it's 18 months at least, at DOI. When it's taking that long to actually get rates. That's been one of the issues.
Even if they want to lower them.
And but they're not lowering them, I can tell you
right.
that. But that is a problem when you have that much bureaucracy in the way. Now, look, I will say these emergency regulations that have been promulgated by the insurance commissioner, I think are going to help. But again, we've been sitting here in the legislature for the last 4 years at least talking about this impending insurance crisis, and not one major piece of legislation has moved through trying to address it. Republicans, we certainly have been talking about it, but we don't get to control the place. Mm-hmm. And so ultimately, we have, I think, not done our job in the legislature of adequately addressing it. You do have to stabilize the market. People are leaving the state. Insurance companies are leaving the state. They're not writing policies. You got to immediately work to do that. But the other thing that you need to do is you have to mitigate risk. Mm-hmm. Insurance is about risk. And right now, California is very risky. Why is it risky? Because of fuel. That's why, because we have a tinderbox of fuel up and down the state, in our forested areas, in our coastal mountains, and it just takes one spark. Whether that spark comes from a PG&E power line, or a tire blowout on the highway, or a lightning strike, a lot of different, or an arsonist. Unfortunately, we've had too much of that as well. These fires, they burn hotter, and they have a ton of fuel to burn with. Mm-hmm. Right? And so until you deal with the risk and you really mitigate that risk in and around communities and get on top of that, it's going to be very difficult to have affordable insurance rates. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why even more in earnest we should be doing this work. We have the governor and the president a while back came to an agreement where they said they were going to do 500,000 acres a year. They haven't even come close. And in fact, the governor got caught in a lie a few years ago when he said he did 90,000 acres, and it turned out he only did 11,000. But the bottom line is we haven't been doing the job. It needs more funding, and it needs the regulatory relief. Mm-hmm. There is a project right now. It's going to be one of the largest fuel reduction projects in the Plumas National Forest. That's where we had the Dixie Fire, which was the biggest acreage fire in California history. That's where we had the North Complex fire, that burned all the way to Lake Oroville. They're planning this project, and right now it's getting sued by an environmental group to stall it up. This stuff can't happen. And a lot of what they're doing is prescribed burns, which a lot of people said that's what we need to really get into, is do prescribed burns as well as thinning. These are all things we can do, but it's getting stalled in a place that's burned already twice in these huge fires. We can't let that happen anymore. We have to remove those barriers so that we reduce risk, and we make California a place where insurers are going to go, okay, I feel comfortable writing that rate because you've actually done something to mitigate the wildfire risk.
Do you think we're at a tipping point in the sense that we've seen now residential fires in the north, residential fires in the south? We know that it is the fuel from the forests, and we also know fires jump highways. And when you have property that burns on the beach, do we think and we have now we have a whole new class of legislators, a turnover of 40 folks. Is there hope for now a tipping point that California will begin to take a look at this because it's just now a accumulation of crises?
Well, we're past the tipping point. And the tipping point was a year or two ago, is now can we recover? So I don't know if anybody here lives in an HOA with multiple family buildings, but that's really, they're under a lot of pressure right now. If you have a 4-unit building in an HOA, likely your fire insurance is being canceled in California. My mom lives in an HOA in Colorado, and not in the mountains of Colorado, on the prairies of Colorado. There's no forests around my mom's house in Colorado. And her insurance, their HOA insurance, is being canceled, and the insurance company said because of what's happening in California. We're past the tipping point.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I mean, I hear I think the right words coming out of people's mouths lately after these fires, but it needs to result in action. And for me, the frustration has been to see that we focus rather on banning gas-powered vehicles or banning leaf blowers. And look, you might say, look, climate change is the issue here, and it does play a factor for sure. It's an exacerbator of drier periods here in California, but we've always had the problem of fire and flood in California, always, right? But what we need to do is actually mitigate the risk, right? And even if tomorrow, for the true believers out there, right, they really say, hey, what we really need to do is just ban all fossil fuel. I disagree with you. I don't think that's the right way to go. But if you said we're going to ban fossil fuel and we're going to have all electric from now on, how long till the climate changes back? In the meantime, we're still going to have these fuel loads. We're still going to have drier conditions. We're still going to have wetter wets. And you better start doing the mitigation and the infrastructure improvement that you need to ensure that you can keep your community safe. And wildfire is the number one exhibit A, that you better get out there and do something about vegetation and fuel and ignition points. Right? Where are the dangerous ignition points? Well, power lines. So we better do insulated lines to help avoid sparks. We can do undergrounding where that makes sense as well. We can, along our highways and our roadways, we should be doing a whole lot of vegetation work, because often actually, just from tire blowouts or other things, people throwing things out that cause a fire, along roadways is a lot where fires. So harden your ignition points. All those things are things that we can do to better make sure that our communities are going to be safer from wildfire in the long term.
Thank you. I want to turn to another challenge for California that's been around for some time, and is the over 180,000 individuals in California estimated to be unhoused. And last fall, 1 in 8 Californians who were surveyed by our PPIC survey said homelessness is the top issue facing our state. We have a lot of top issues facing our state. But in your view, what are the most important actions state leaders can take to substantially reduce homelessness, Senator?
So the homeless conversation is very frustrating to me, because I've offered a couple of bills that deal with a very slim segment of the homeless community, homeless population. And James and some of his assembly colleagues have introduced bills. Even some of our Democrat colleagues have introduced bills. And then there's this big group of advocates, associations, nonprofits that come out and they speak against these bills that we're trying to do common sense reform. And their number one argument seems to be, that's not the solution. That's not the solution. That's not the solution. And I finally picked up on, okay, I get that it's not the solution, because there isn't the solution. There's 180,000 homeless people in California right now. We probably need 180,000 solutions. They're all individuals. They're all human beings. They're all somebody's kid. A lot of times somebody's parent, somebody's sister, somebody's brother, right? And we have this advocacy group in California that think they're coming at this from a compassionate standpoint, or that's the persona that they put on their advocacy. I don't think it's compassionate at all to continue to pass regulations or not pass reforms that help people get off. It's uncompassionate to allow people to stay on the street, period, regardless of why they're there. And so I tried to shift my messaging to, look, I understand this isn't the solution. This is a piece of a solution to identify a part of the homeless population that we can begin to help and get off the streets. One of the things that overarching that we have to do is criminal reform and drug rehabilitation reform. And Prop 36 from November is going to do some of that. It's not going to do all of it. It's not going to do enough, but it's a start, and I think it'll have a positive impact.
Thank you. Assemblymember Gallagher?
So, I mean, we've spent now going over $25 billion on our homeless strategy here in California. The problem is demonstrably worse. So when you're digging a hole, what's the first thing that you should do? Stop digging. Like, stop doing what you're doing. It's not working. And here's why it's not working. Because largely what we've done is just dole out lots of money to all kinds of different groups, different nonprofit groups, government agencies, and with no idea of actually what they're doing and what results they're getting. And that became very clear last year when we actually are the ones that call for it. Assemblymember Hoover from Sacramento said, we need an audit of this money and figure out what's going on. Well, they came back, nobody's keeping any real metrics.
You can't even audit it.
Right? I mean, nobody at the governor's office and who's overseeing it was keeping any metrics on this money. There's been no accountability. And that's a big problem. What should we do instead? Here's what I think, is we should be actually having more regional approaches. It shouldn't be a statewide, top-down approach with the money. It should be each region should be coming up with their own plans for how you deal with homelessness. And I think a lot of it is, first, stop the enablement strategy. You don't bring needles to people on the street and say, yeah, keep living out here on the street and give everything to them on the streets. You need to have places where you can actually get off the street first, so that's emergency shelter, right? Shelter space. Here's where you can go to get off of the street. We already have counties and local governments who do a lot of great work getting people connected to resources. We could have wraparound services at those emergency shelters. And then we fund the regional plans that have been brought together, as opposed to just sending out money and saying, oh, I hope they spend it well. That's not an approach that's going to work very, in the long term. And ultimately, the policies need to be ones that are empowering people out of homelessness, not enabling them into it. I mean, a lot of what we've done is actually just give people things and services and keep them exactly where they're at. And what Senator Jones is talking about is some of the policies have changed now, where we're saying, look, some people with severe mental illness, for example, you have to get them off of the street and get them medicated, and that requires conservatorships. And we supported that legislation. It was actually bipartisan to finally do that. Those are some of the things you have to do. But what you don't do is say, yeah, it's okay for you to be out here. It's okay for you to continue what you're doing. Obviously, this is not good for you, number one, because you're going to die out here. And number two, it's not good for society because now nobody can use public spaces. Now you can't go, to City Hall and to the city park. When your kids can't play in the parks because there's syringes, everywhere and in the waterways, that's not good for anybody, right? And so, we have to change that mentality, and I think we have. It has started to shift, but we need to do so in earnest.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I think the audience would like to ask some questions.
My flight's not till 4:30, so I can stay to later.
And so, with that in mind, we have some PPIC folks who have microphones. They'll come to you to ask the question. We do ask, however, that you state your name before you ask the question. And if you're with a company or a business, please let us know who you're with. And you can pose the question. And I'm going to look at Sal, and he's going to point to me.
One over here.
Yes, thank you.
I'll take the easy ones. James will take the hard ones.
Anne, go ahead. We'll come back. Okay, we'll come back. I see a hand here, Erin.
Hi, my name's Lisa Howard, and I heard you talk about, the fuel buildup, which I understand in California, and before we settled California, almost all of it burned almost every year or two. That was the nature. But I haven't heard you say anything about and I know it brings in more regulation potentially, any responsibilities for the people that are rebuilding in the fire-prone areas. I mean, don't the insurance companies want people to build, if you're going to rebuild in a fire-prone area, that yes, you can clear the underbrush, but it's going to come back by definition. Why not have expectations on people to build in a more fire-resistant way so that it's safer the next time it burns? Because even if you clear the underbrush, 5-10 years later, you have more underbrush. So it seems like a repeating problem if you don't change the construction in those spaces.
So in my area, I had two huge fires, one in 2003 and one in 2007, that were the biggest fires in San Diego County up until that point in time. And so San Diego County and the rest of the state has really reformed the construction standards for new homes in the fire-prone areas. So if you come to San Diego, and I would imagine the same things in Paradise, the houses that have been rebuilt are completely different than the houses that burnt down. And the entire area, the community around that reconstruction is doing kind of exactly what you're saying. Roofing materials are different, boxing the eaves is different, even the foundations are different. The types of appliances that you're able to have on the outside, are different. And then I think there was a statistic, and I'll have to confirm this, but I think there's a statistic in California since 2010, no new home community in a fire-prone area that's been built in a fire-prone area has burned since 2010. It's something like that. So the new construction, newer homes are more resilient to wildfire, and the communities that they're built in.
Yeah, so there's a lot to what you said there, and I liked where you started, which is, California used to burn all the time. Yeah, and California has a history of fires. But the natives, of California, the Native Americans in California actually used to burn. They would do real prescribed burns. They would say, look, we've had such a fuel buildup here, we need to burn that. And it would burn, in the case of the forested lands, it would burn the floor of the forest, not the canopy. You wouldn't have a catastrophic fire. They would set the fire so that you would get out all of the underbrush and undergrowth, and so it would be clean, and you wouldn't have devastating catastrophic wildfire. And the history of civilization here in California has been that we put out every fire, and then we don't do any of that kind of work.
Right.
And then we shut down the logging industry for other reasons, but that has definitely played a huge factor as we don't do logging on a lot of federal land, and so that it exacerbates that problem. So we need to get back to that place where we actually do prescribed burns, where we do thinning, where we remove those fuels, and that will actually make communities safer, and you won't have these catastrophic wildfires. But also, and after the Camp Fire, there was an LA legislator that had posed the question, well, should you really even be building there? And And I was saying, well, I mean, should we build in San Francisco where we have devastating earthquakes? I mean, should we build in the valley floor where we have floods? I mean, pretty soon you're not going to be building anywhere in California if you're going to talk about it that way. No, the issue is always this: are you mitigating risk? Are you actually mitigating the risk there to make the community safe? Paradise was a community for well over 120 years, and yeah, it had some fire scares. There have been different fires. But previously we had an active logging industry, in the Plumas National Forest. There was a lot more management, and over the last at least 30 years, we've had nothing, to the point where the Plumas National Forest became a place where we had 10-foot tall piles of brush. You couldn't even go into the forest in those areas, and that is what created the conflagration that ultimately burned, the town of Paradise. Winds. People talk a lot about winds. There's high winds. Does anybody from Southern California know that the Santa Ana winds are a thing? That they blow really hard and really fast? Yeah, of course they do. That is not new. It has always been the case, right? The same thing in Paradise. We have, high wind events. We've always had high wind events. But when you add fuel to that equation and a spark that falls on that tinderbox, that's why we have the kind of conflagrations that we do. And so that's why I really think that's got to be the focus. And lastly, insurance. Insurance is really the thing that should help make that decision, right? If you truly have market-based insurance, right, that's considering the risks and the factors, then people will have to make the decision. Okay, I mean, if it is very, very risky, and the economic realities are actually reflecting that risk, then insurance is going to be really expensive. And you're either gonna decide to build there with that very expensive insurance, or you're not. So to me, actually, insurance and that market and the market realities of economics should help decide where we're gonna build or rebuild or all those kinds of things. Not government saying, oh, I don't think you should build there.
Good question. Thank you. Great answers. Ann.
Hi, I'm Harrison. I'm a senior at McClatchy. And Mr. Gallagher, you already talked on it a little bit, but I wanted to ask more. You said that a lot of the bills that you presented got killed in committee, and we've been learning about that a lot all year, but wanted to ask, how do you, as the assembly leader, maintain a position of actual leadership and getting things done and collaborating with, is it Mike McGuire? Is that pro tem right now? Is that what you're talking about?
That's who he works with,
yeah.
but I have Robert Rivas on my side as
Okay,
speaker.
but yeah, I just want to know, how do you make sure that you and your colleagues get what you desire across in a position where you're leading a really, a real minority?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, so that has been a real frustration, is because I think that as Republicans, we're the minority party, right? But we feel like we have good ideas too. And we really just we want to have the opportunity to get heard and at least have our bills actually heard, and give me the chance to bring that bill in committee, right, and convince my colleagues. I once had a bill in privacy, and I'm forgetting what bill it was now. I think it had to do with social media and a lot of stuff that we're talking about now, content, and really ensuring kind of a free marketplace of ideas type of bill, right? I went into that committee and my staff was like, hey, you have 2 votes, everybody else is probably not voting with you, right? And I was like, okay, well, and she goes, and by the way, you're one of the votes, right? So I have, all right, cool, well, but I had the opportunity, and I went in there, I presented my bill, and true story, I got the bill out. I convinced people in committee. I mean, I made a very compelling argument, very compelling, but ultimately I had the chance and I had the opportunity, and after hearing my colleagues hearing from me, I was able to move that forward. So one thing I think is just having the ability to have the conversation with colleagues. I also, look, as a minority member, I lobby everybody on the committee. Mm-hmm. I don't, no matter who you are, I'm gonna come and talk to you about my bill and say, hey, here's why I think, this is a good idea. And I'll tell you the other thing that does happen is, even though maybe sometimes our bills, well, many times our bills are killed, on party line votes. The other thing that we can do is we sometimes can find a colleague on the other side of the aisle who maybe takes up that idea and takes something from what we were doing and moves it forward. And this isn't maybe the best example, but on Wildfire, one of the things that we ultimately did, we haven't been able to get very far on the CEQA environmental review side, but on the funding side, in the aftermath of the Dixie Fire, and finding out that we weren't doing enough, Newsom got called out in Capitol Public Radio for not doing enough on the fuel reduction side. All those things came together, and we worked with colleagues on the other side and said, let's make a real investment. And in that year, I like to say we had to damn near shame them to do it, but working together and also applying the pressure and the public pressure of needing this to be done, we put almost $1 billion of funding into Wildfire that year. And I think that was a lot due to the minority party pushing the issue and also working across the aisle and finding alignment with Democrats to get that through. That was a really good moment. The negative is, ever since that time, that budget has slowly decreased back down. We needed to get it back up. But there's definitely those opportunities, even in the minority, to be a part of moving substantive change.
Thank you for that question, and a good answer for young people to hear, to find a way to success, even at first maybe you don't succeed. Thank you. We have an online question, and after that it's going to go to Sal.
Thanks, Tani. So this question comes from Kate Gordon, CEO of California Forward. And Kate's question is, Rusty mentioned in his intro that California used to have a rural caucus, but no longer does. Much of the state's economy comes from activities in our inland and rural regions: travel, tourism, agriculture, energy, and more. And the question is, how can we elevate the voice of rural and inland regions in Sacramento, given the reality that these are not the most populated areas of the state?
Well, I think some of that's probably going to take care of itself this year, because now LA, I mean, when he's talking, let's not build in the areas that he mentioned, then I'm thinking, well, how about not build in LA anymore? I mean, if LA is going to have a fire, let's not build there. And so some of our colleagues that are from these urban areas that haven't had to deal with these rural issues are now having to deal, I mean, wildfire is a statewide issue now. And, kind of back to the Assembly member's point earlier about the bipartisan, a lot of our colleagues across the aisle really do desire to have a bipartisan relationship and a bipartisan effort on a lot of issues and a lot of bills and stuff. So I think that's coming around a little bit. And he and I are both from rural areas. My district is half city of San Diego and half farmland of San Diego County. And so having people come to our districts, it's easy to get people to San Diego. I've been to his district. It's pretty nice too. It's just up to us having those conversations and making sure that we're educating our urban colleagues that these issues are statewide now.
Have you ever heard of the state of Jefferson? It's a very common frustration, and Stacy is, here from RCRC. Those are the rural counties, that get together. They have their own association, and for a long time we feel this. We don't get attention, and our issues often are very different, from the urban parts of California. And I'll just give you one really concrete example: trucks. Okay. We really need trucks in rural areas. And why? I mean, first of all, farmland, all the food that you eat, right, that we grow, it has to get to market, right? And it gets to market on a truck, right? But over the past, 15 years, we've had regulation after regulation that makes it impossible for us to keep trucks that we need on the road. And we end up having to get rid of them, or we have to update the engines, and now we're talking about, no, and by the way, we want you to go all electric, right? Well, here's the problem out here in rural country part of California. We can't afford an electric truck. Secondly, they're actually not available. Some of the big fleets, the big trucking guys, they're trying to get them and they can't even get them, right? And then where are we going to charge it? We don't have charging stations. And they only go about 300 miles on a single charge, maybe at best. and we need to go thousands of miles, to truck goods to where we need to get them. So like, just think about that. When we're passing policies and we try to bring this up to our colleagues, take into account rural California and the needs that we have.
Thank you. And PPIC had a great program last year on rural counties, and it was truly, it gave a terrific perspective. And I know that we are over time, but the senator said he was here till 4:30. So we're going to go with one more question, Sal.
Hi, thank you. Bob Brown with the Western States Petroleum Association. Thank you both for being here, and I appreciate what you were just talking about the trucks. So I'll reframe my question. There's been a lot of attention on the oil and gas industry. Governor's called 2 special sessions. It's given the California Energy Commission a lot more authority. There's some 30 agencies that oversee our operations. Do you see the demand for our product is still very strong today in this state. Do you see a change of direction or an all of the above energy strategy, maybe a movement toward that in the legislature anytime soon?
That's a tough question, actually, because it's a little bit early in the year, and now we've been distracted by the fires. And I will say that the oil industry in California has done a pretty good, decent job in recent year of changing the narrative. We've been under pressure ideologically for so long in California that oil and gas is bad and it's destroying the globe. But we're still using it in California. And now so what the industry's done well is tell the story that producing oil in California is the safest for people and the cleanest for the environment than anywhere else in the world. But what we're doing because of these regulations over the last couple of decades is we're actually shipping oil in from Ecuador, Russia, Southeast Asia, other countries that are oil-producing countries, and we're bringing in oil to California for Californians, and we're shipping it on dirty tanker ships that burn bunker fuel to get here, and the greenhouse gas emissions is actually worse than if we just did it here in California. So you're making progress on that. I don't think you've made enough progress on that. I doubt that the young people in the audience today have heard that story. If they haven't, they need to hear the story. The other thing that I think has done well to turn the narrative on that is somebody produced a video called 1 Day Without Oil, or 1 Week Without Oil, whatever it is. And it's very telling that, even your environmentally safe Tesla car, EV, whatever EV you drive, you can't have that without oil because about everything on it is a derivative of some kind of oil product. And so you guys are doing a better job of getting the other side of the story out there. We have a long ways to go on that. And I'm just going to say plainly, everything the governor wants to do in the oil and gas industry is 100% wrong. So we just need to do the opposite, and we'll have a thriving economy in California, we'll have a cleaner environment, and we'll have safer workers.
Thank you. Assembly member.
Somebody was clapping, at least one person was clapping, so I appreciate that.
I guess this is where we're ending. Let me end on this is, addressing climate is really important, right? And we should be working to lower emissions, right? And that is a really good goal, but we've been doing it in probably the worst way possible, right? And let me explain a little bit why. We've done it mostly through a lot of mandates that say you can't use this, or you can't, or we're going to, force you to go solar or to go electric. All these different mandates, right? Which, by the way, who is that really empowering? Where do you get a lot of the solar panels that are coming from? China. Where are you getting a lot of the EVs, that are coming from China? They're building 2 coal-fired plants a week in China. So are we tackling the climate problem by empowering China, who's actually increasing emissions, right? And actually building more coal-fired plants, basically. And then, but we lose the jobs, right? And we are losing jobs like in the oil and gas industry, for instance. They're good paying, blue collar jobs. In an industry that is actually getting more, the technology is making it so that we actually have less emissions, right? And we're going to renewable diesel and things like that are coming out. All of these things actually the industry is getting better, they're cleaner. They're actually more environmentally sound. We're taking away those jobs, and those jobs are going overseas, okay? That's not really good. Those Venezuela and Ecuador, where we're importing our oil from, do you think they're really good to the rainforest? No, they're not. Actually, they're cutting down the rainforest. You know, they're more environmental devastation and degradation. Where do you get all the components for your lithium battery that's in your electric vehicle? From mining that's going on in the Congo, where there's slave labor, right? And then by the way, when those EVs we found out new problems with these electric vehicles. They catch on fire. And when they do, they shut down highways, right? And it takes a really long time to get the fire out and clear them. And when they burn up in wildfires, you know what one of the biggest issues right now in the hazardous waste cleanup of the Palisades is, for example, and in Altadena, is getting rid of these lithium batteries that they describe as sort of ticking time bombs that could explode and cause another problem. Like, so there's a lot of issues with the way that we've done this. And then, oh, by the way, we did all this and we didn't do the things like cleaning our forests, removing fuel, which actually reduces carbon. You know, a healthy forest is a carbon sink. A dead and dying beetle-infested forest is emitting carbon, right? And then we have these fires, and millions of metric tons of carbon go up into the atmosphere and obliterate all of the gains that we've made. So, like, I'm sorry, but it's a completely ass-backwards way of addressing climate change. And there's a better way to do it. It's a balanced approach, a more affordable approach also, by the way. You know, because what we've been doing is jacked up your utility costs and made them the highest in the nation, right? So why is none of this stuff is the way that you should approach it? And look, so James, what's the better way? I would say a balanced energy approach. I actually love solar. I love wind. But we also need natural gas to keep the lights on. And we also need oil and gas produced here in California because it's safer and it provides really good jobs and it's more environmentally friendly than Ecuador and Venezuela and these other places that we're going to, you know, a more balanced energy approach is more affordable. It is lowering emissions because we are actually over the long term, we're lowering emissions in the long term doing that. And then we're also providing good paying jobs and we're continuing to innovate, and technologically we're getting better. And that's how we're actually lowering those things. And by the way, we should actually have other countries start doing their job, right, to lower emissions as well, instead of just taking the whole burden on ourselves, and then finally, you know, make our forests healthy, make our landscapes safe, so that we're keeping our communities safe and we're lowering carbon emissions. I think that would be a better policy going forward. And I don't see why we can't do it. It could be very bipartisan, and it could accomplish the job in a much better way than we are right now. Thank you for the question, Bob. Thank you for the answer. I wish we had more time. I want to thank the Sheraton staff for your patience with us overstaying our time here. I also want to thank all of you, and especially our leaders today, Senator Jones and also Assemblymember Gallagher, for having this conversation with PPIC. Safe travels in the rain, and we have another speaker series event March 6th. We hope you come.
And please follow us on social media. Good job.